everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a bonded fabric, so on one side it has a crepe and on the other side a jersey. It doesn't have any stretch in it, quite a structured fabric and a good weight to it. Good for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my sleeve. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, a few notches to mark my pleat placement, and the usual sleeve notches. So the first thing to do here is to sew that center line. So making sure my notches line up, making sure my bottom edge lines up and pinning, and stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting right at the edge of that notch, down to the hem. So that's the first part of forming my pleats complete. Now for the second. So I have a little notch right in the center. I'm lining it up with the seam you've just seen me sew and ready to stitch. And I'm being really careful here to stick to my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way across. I'll give that a press and turn it right side out, and this is the result. Super happy with this. And for finishing the hem of my sleeve, I've decided on a facing. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch marking the center, and I'm cutting this piece out twice. So lining up my notch with the center of my sleeve and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. And in preparation for understitching, I want to press the facing away from the sleeve, but make sure that that seam allowance in underneath is butted up against it. And ready to stitch through the facing, through that seam allowance in underneath, and I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the sleeve, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. Now that just needs a good press, which I've went ahead and done off camera. I've also just finished my underarm seams and that bottom edge on the overlocker. And now that that's done, this piece is ready to be joined to my dress. This is my back. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, the usual sleeve notch, and a notch for my zip. So the first thing to do here is to mark my darts. So popping a pin in at each of their points, and then replacing where the pin pierces the fabric with a chalk mark. Now just to join up the dots. I'll do exactly the same on the other side. And ready to pin. So starting at the center, going in through one dot, out through the other, making sure my dart legs top and bottom are matched. And ready to sew. Leaving a tail at the start, following those chalk lines the whole way up, giving myself a smooth curve there at the center, and pulling my threads to finish. So they've had a press, I've tied off my threads, and this is how they look. with that. So now to close up that centre back seam, my fabric is right sides together, and I'm going to stitch from the top of my split to my zip notch with a regular stitch length, and then from my zip notch up to the neck with the longest stitch length on my machine, starting with a back stitch, coming up to my zip notch, back stitching again, increasing my stitch length, and continuing right the whole way up to the neck. So I just need to finish my edges and press that seam open, which I've went ahead and done here. So now I'm ready for my zip. I'm using a standard conceal zip here, and I'm lining up the zipper teeth with the center of that seam, and I'm going to hand stitch it the whole way down. So just taking long tacking stitches, sewing the zip tape to that seam allowance. I'll finish that off camera. So now that that's done, I can remove those machine tacking stitches using my seam ripper here just to open up that centre back seam. And once it's all done, I can now open up my zipper, making it much easier for me to sew my zip into place nice and neatly. Using my standard zipper foot, being really careful here the whole way up, trying to sew as close as possible to the zipper teeth without going through them. Back stitching to finish, and I'll do exactly the same on the other side. I'll remove that hand tacking thread, and this is what I get. Super happy with this. So there's one final thing I want to add just to finish off my zip, and that is a little bit of facing. So I've cut myself a rectangle of standard lining fabric, and I'm just lining it up with the seam allowance on one side and ready to stitch, sewing through the facing, through the zipper tape and through that seam allowance. And what this will do is just provide a barrier between my skin and that sort of plastic feel of the zip, which I really like. So I've given that a press. And that completes my zip installation. So now this piece is ready to be joined to my front at the shoulder. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece. I have a notch to mark the bottom of my V, the usual sleeve notch, and just like the sleeve before, a few notches to mark my pleat placement. So the first thing to do here is to form those pleats. So folding the bodice over the skirt, matching up my edges, matching up my notches, and ready to sew. Starting at the centre front with a back stitch, sewing at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, a couple of tiny little pivots here, and finishing with a back stitch. So I just need to snip my edges, press and turn everything right side out, and this is how it looks. And of course I've done exactly the same thing on the other side, and now these 2 pieces are ready to be joined at that centre front. So making sure those pleats are out of the way, my fabric is right sides together and ready to sew. Back stitching to start, at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, and back stitching to finish. And I'll press that seam open and finish those edges off camera. And while I was there, I've also ran my side seams and shoulder seams through the overlocker just to tidy them up. So the next thing to do is to secure the points of my pleat to the bodice front. So making sure everything's aligned and running a few invisible hand stitches to hold those pleats in place. So that's that done. Super happy with this. So now to join this piece to my back at the shoulders. My fabric is right sides together. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and finish. So I've pressed that seam open, and the next thing to do is to stabilize the neck. So I'm using here a tiny little organza ribbon, and I'm just lining it up at the edge of my seam allowance and running a stitch line from the back neck right the whole way around to the front on both sides. And this is just going to help to stop that neckline from stretching out while I'm wearing this little dress. So I've given that a press. And now to close up the neckline, I've chosen a facing. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, a little notch to mark the bottom of my V-neck, and the first thing to do here is to join these 2 pieces together along the centre front. Stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. I've pressed that seam open, and now this piece is ready for my back facing. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece and just lining up those shoulder seams on both sides and pinning into place. And stitching again at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and finish. So I'll press that seam open, and I'll also finish off the edge the whole way around, which you can see here. So now this piece is ready to be joined to my dress. So lining up my notches, my shoulder seam, and my centre back. And stitching here, starting at the centre back, little pivot there at the neck, being really careful over those zipper teeth, coming down to the point of my V, again being really careful here that my last stitch is right on that point, and repeating on the other side. Finishing with a back stitch. So I've trimmed my edges, and just like the sleeve before, I want to understitch here. So pressing the facing away from the bodice, making sure that seam allowance in underneath is butted up against it, and stitching about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the bodice, through the facing, through that seam allowance in underneath, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start and finish. And what this understitching is doing is helping that facing to sit nicely tucked away in underneath. And to further help that, I want to stitch the facing down at my seams. So I've already pinned the facing to my shoulder seams. I'm doing exactly the same thing here on the center front. And I'm going to stitch in the ditch to join these two pieces together. So placing my needle right in the center of that seam, taking this nice and gently, and if I've done this correctly, you shouldn't be able to see my stitches here. Happy with that. So that's my facing all attached and stitched at my seam lines. So now I'm ready for my sleeves. My fabric is right sides together, lining up my side seams, front notch, shoulder notch, back notch and back side seam, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking this nice and gently the whole way around, trying to avoid any little wrinkles in my fabric, and finishing with a back stitch. So I finished my seams on the overlocker and pressed. And now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my side seams. Lining up my edges. And ready to sew. Starting at the hem with a back stitch at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way up, and finishing at the hem of the sleeve. So I've pressed open my seams. I've also folded my sleeve facing in underneath and pinned into place, ready for hand stitching. So I'm just running a herringbone stitch right along the edge of the facing, picking up a little bit of fabric from the sleeve at a diagonal down to the facing, little bit of fabric from there, and repeating. I'll finish that off camera. I'll also do exactly the same stitch around the hem of the dress, and this is the result. Nice and neat and tidy. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have my V-neck all faced and understitched, got my sleeves in place with their pleat detail and faced. And then the main feature of this dress is those gorgeous centre front pleats, nicely stitched down, and my hand stitched hem. And then at the back, I have my zip in place with its facing. Nice little bit of shaping with those waist darts, and my split at the bottom. And this is how it looks on. So I am so happy with this dress. I've wanted to make this for a very long time and couldn't quite work out how to make the pattern. This looks very like the inspiration pics. Some of you guys might have seen them over on Instagram. Of course, I put my own take on the design with that V-neck, which I absolutely love. And of course, adding those sleeves. And of course, to match with the pleats on the centre front, I had to add that pleat to the sleeve. And I'm very happy I did, because I love how this whole thing looks. I love the length of the skirt. This fabric is so nice, super comfortable against the skin. I am over the moon with this.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!